Hello, everyone. So welcome to another Genomics Aotearoa seminar. This one I'm really excited about. So a friend of mine, Ronald Jenner from the Natural History Museum in London, has agreed to come and talk to us. Ronald is no stranger to New Zealand. He often comes here to torture centipedes in an attempt to extract their venom, and he has in fact written a most excellent book on venom that you should go out, buy and read. But today he's actually talking about another book he's written, which is called Ancestors in Evolutionary Biology. I have a copy if you want to borrow it, but you'd be better off actually buying it because you know it's very shiny. I actually feel, having read the book, it addresses a whole load of questions that I have about how we interpret phylogenetics and how that those interpretations challenge the way that we should think about the evolution of life on Earth, and I thought it would be really cool to hear Ronald talk about that. So without further ado, I'm going to let Ronald get on his way. If you can turn off your videos and mute your microphones, just so we're preserving bandwidth, and hopefully we'll have time for some questions at the end. So Ronald, off you go.
Right, so the pandemic, yes, that is still fresh in our memory, I think. It's been a time that's been bad for many of us. My wife managed to contract COVID. She's still suffering from the effects of it, horrible long COVID. But now what I did in the forced seclusion is finish writing a book that I've been working on for a long time, which you can see here on the right, Ancestors in Evolutionary Biology. Now, when I told my friend Dave Williams, a colleague from the museum, that I was writing a book on ancestors, he said, well, Ron, there will be a very thin one then. And he has a point. You know, if you would open the drawers in the Natural History Museum, even in the Department of Paleontology, you would be very hard-pressed to find ancestors. Even if you go to the outside world, most taxa that we know of are terminal tips of evolving lineages, not ancestors. In the end, though, it turned out I needed 385 pages and 12 chapters to get my thoughts about ancestors out. And this talk, I will talk essentially about some of what is in one of the chapters. Now, if you don't find ancestors out there in nature or in the drawers of museums, what is there? Well, of course, there is something. And there is this thing called hypothetical ancestors. This is a professor and a curator at the American Museum of Natural History. This is Michael Novosek. And in 2013, he was interviewed for the LA Times. Why? Well, he and his co-authors had published a paper in Science, and it was a big phylogenetic analysis of all mammals. And they looked at more than 4,500 morphological characters. They used fossils, they used living taxa. And the objective of this huge exercise was to reconstruct what the hypothetical ancestor of placental mammals might have looked like. And this is the cute tree shrew-like creature you see here on the right. And then when he was interviewed, for this achievement, he was asked about it, and he said, "Well, this is fairly novel to reconstruct an ancestor. I don't know of any other," which I found a puzzling statement. Yes, this ancestor is reconstructed in exquisite detail. They know its dental formula, they know the shape of its uterus. But when I browse the literature, I see a veritable zoo of hypothetical ancestors marching through the pages of the comparative literature, including in the lower right corner, a creature very similar to the placental hypothetical ancestor reconstructed by Novosek and colleagues. Now, he elaborated, this cute creature stoked the imagination of people. And so people asked, have you given it a name? And he said, no, I tell them we can't give it a Latin name because it never really existed. It doesn't have a nickname either. It's just the hypothetical placental mammal ancestor. Well, is this good science communication? Wouldn't you think that when you have a densely sampled, phylogenetically framed comparative study like theirs, that the inferences on the basis thereof will give you some clue about the possible nature of real ancestors, creatures that must have lived at some point in deep time? Yes, they are hypothetical because they're inferential products, but a creature like this, we hope, would have existed at some point in history if this study was worth the money spent on it. So what is going on? If you think about evolution, there is a fundamental truth, and it's largely invisible. That is, the bedrock of evolutionary descent are evolutionary lineages. So in this little picture, you can see the time axis going from the bottom to the top of the picture. And you see a horizontal bar that denotes the present time. So if you compare in the present time, the blackbird and the gray bird, you can see that they are part of two lineages that have split from some ancestral lineage deeper in time, which is in gray at the bottom of the picture. And if you want to know what these probably extinct ancestral creatures look like, well, the only thing you can do is a comparative analysis. So if you look at this phylogeny on the right, if you want to know, for instance, what the mammalian ancestor look like, and these are the taxa that you have observable evidence from, in this case, a cat and a human, then this ancestor at the red dot, you reconstruct with the observations from these taxa. If you want to know what the tetrapod ancestor might have looked like, the blue dot, then you can compare these 5 tetrapod specimens or species to reconstruct what may have happened in the lineages that underpin them. And you can use morphology, you can use behavior, you can even use genomics. This is the only time I'm going to use the word genomics in this entire talk, so I hope this quickens your pulse appropriately. Now, there's 2 distinct realms. You have at the top, where the pictures of the animals are, the realm of taxa. This is the realm of the observable, empirically accessible evidence for evolution. And then these lineages that connect them is the realm of inferable, generally unnamed lineages. They are generally not observable unless you work, for instance, on laboratory strains of bacteria, when you actually can observe lineages evolving in your freezer over time. Most of what we can say about lineage evolution is based on inference. And the realm of taxa is, of course, branching realm. You can see it is a realm of the relationships between collateral relatives, evolutionary cousins. And it's very different from the relationship that obtains in the realm of lineages. That is the realm of ancestors and direct descendants. And the process in the realm of taxa that produced this branching structure, of course, is called cladogenesis, the splitting of lineages. The process that drives evolution in the lineages of ancestors and descendants is anagenesis. That is simply evolution within unbranching lineages. So for instance, if you go from the bottom, the root of the tree, all the way up to the human, you follow the blue arrows up to the yellow dot, and then you follow the red arrows. It is simply a linear chain of ancestors tracking the arrow of time. Fourth, when you look at taxa, virtually all known and described and named taxa are the terminal products of evolution. Whereas if you want to look at where evolution happened, where ancestors transformed into descendants, you need to look in the realm of lineages, and that is the realm of evolutionary descent. So finally, there's 2 different ways of thinking about these different realms. One is called tree thinking, and that is the realm of the collateral relationships, the branching relationships between evolutionary cousins. And that term tree thinking is, of course, probably familiar to many of you. But there is no term for thinking about the realm of lineages. So I coined it in my book, and I call this lineage thinking. So if at this point you're already quite bored because, well, I know all this, you may well muse to yourself. Hang on, it's going to get more interesting than this. Tree thinking is a term that originated in 1988, and it was coined by the biologist Robert O'Hara. He elaborated his thought in a number of papers in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and 3 of these are mentioned here. And he was inspired to come up with tree thinking by cladistics. Cladistics is simply the approach to systematics that studies the branching relationships between taxa, specifically on the basis of shared derived characters only. What do I mean? If you have a human and you have a lizard and you have a snake, you cannot say, oh, the lizard and the human are more closely related because both have 2 pairs of limbs. On the level of this comparison, limbs are already a primitive character because limbs originated way earlier in evolution than the comparison of some reptiles and mammals. So the loss of limbs in snakes may mislead you into believing that limbs are informative on this level. No, they are not a shared derived character here, they're a shared primitive character. And that is essentially everything that there is to it. Cladistics is simply looking at shared derived characters to reconstruct the branching relationships of taxa. And of course, as I said, it is ubiquitous. The term is everywhere on the internet, in the professional literature, in the popular literature, in the educational literature, most notably in a 2013 book, Tree Thinking: An Introduction to Phylogenetic Biology by David Baum and Stacy Smith. But looking at evolution through cladistic glasses, however necessary it is, because of course, looking at the branching relationships of taxa, that is where the observable evidence is. If you do this too strictly, you can mislead yourself and you can become blind to the realm of lineages. Oh. No, So what do I mean by this? If you looked at the early papers of Robert O'Hara, he was not only inspired by cladistics, he thought that he could fundamentally reform how we should look at evolution. So he said, if you take a tree like the one on the left, and you grab it at any point, you cut it underneath where you hold it, then what you have in your hand is a clade. It's a branched group of taxa. For instance, you grab the human, you cut it at the branch at the yellow node, and you got 4 taxa in a clade in your hand. And therefore, he said, evolution is irreducibly branched. But of course, you can already see there's a problem. If you cut this tree on the lineage between the red dots and the humans, what you have is one single lineages, maybe even a single species in your hand. Evolution is not irreducibly branched, but he failed to see this. And nevertheless, he persisted. He says all these linear, what he called ontogenetic evolutionary narratives that we have constructed over time. For instance, invertebrates turning into mammals, mammals turning into monkeys, monkeys turning into humans. These should be replaced by branching narratives. And I was like, okay, that's interesting, but also a bit weird. What if you're just interested in the lineage of one single taxon? Then the other taxa on diverging branches are literally beside the point. But he says, no, if you tell linear stories in evolution, then what you do is you create artificial closure. You need to talk in branching narratives. To me, this sounds really kind of weird at the moment, because you can tell any linear story of any single lineage if you want. You don't have to tell multiple stories at the same time. However, I was impressed by his writings when I was a PhD student. And when I wrote my PhD thesis, I actually put this epigraph from one of his papers at the beginning. And he says, what we have seen in the recent history of systematics is not simply a dispute over methods and objects. What we see and continue to see is the dying struggle of the great chain of being. And as I thought more about this, I thought there is something wrong about this. And that was one of the impetuses for writing the book that I did. The next 40 minutes or 35 minutes will be 5 stories about the consequences of what happens when you don what I call the cladistic blindfold, where you just look at the branching pattern of evolution and not at the linear pattern of evolving lineages, what errors you can make. Let's start with the first story. The rejection of linear evolutionary imagery and linear narratives as promoted by O'Hara. His argument was echoed extremely widely and extremely influentially by Stephen Jay Gould. For the younger people in this group, Stephen Jay Gould was the most important popularizer of evolutionary biology and paleontology in the second half of the 20th century. He was a Harvard professor, and he was a prolific popular science writer, and he was a major influence for me as well as a student. Reading his books, like Ever Since Darwin, of which you can see here the Dutch translation, was one of the reasons why I wanted to become an evolutionary biologist. But with respect to this cover, he said, well, this is embarrassing to me, because what we here have is the march of progress. My books are dedicated to debunking this picture of evolution, but I have no control over dust jackets for foreign translations. This linear arrangement of taxa marching through evolutionary time was something he thought was a stain from the history of science, the scala naturae, the arranging of organisms on the basis of, say, increasing complexity. It should be replaced by branching. And his writings were super influential. For instance, in the writing of Ian Tattersall, paleoanthropologist at the American Museum of Natural History, I put this slide in simply because I wanted to show you this picture. This is a museum man. His, glasses on the tip of his nose, sits in an office with a wooden desk, drawers behind him, skeletons on the desk, a skeleton behind him. And if you look closely, a glass of red wine. This is a very relaxed attitude to working. But he wrote in a book dedicated to assessing the scientific legacy of Stephen Jay Gould. He said Gould's tireless advocacy of the idea that human phylogeny presents us with a bush rather than with a ladder introduced into paleoanthropological thought a powerful and compelling metaphor that continues to gather momentum. He goes on, and he cites Gould here. Australopithecus, as we know it, is not the ancestor of Homo, and that in any case ladders, evolution as a continuous sequence of ancestors and descendants, do not represent the path of evolution. Do you see how deeply misleading this is? If evolution is not a continuous series of ancestors and descendants, then what is it? And then finally, he says, perhaps most importantly, Steve's tireless propagation of the bush versus ladder imagery influenced the perspective of an entire generation of paleoanthropologists, just as it did their brethren in other areas of evolutionary biology. Considering how much Gould misunderstood the relationship between the linear aspects of evolution and the branching aspects of evolution, this may not be good news. And indeed, his influence was everywhere. This is Donald Prothero. He wrote a popular science book called Evolution, What the Fossils Say and Why It Matters. Donald Prothero dedicated it to Stephen Jay Gould. And he said the tendency to put things into simple linear order is a common metaphor for evolution, and also one of the greatest misperceptions. The iconic image is the classic ape to man sequence of organisms, like shown here in the middle, marching up the evolutionary ladder. This icon of evolution is so familiar that it is parodied endlessly in political cartoons and advertisements. Most people think that this is an accurate representation of evolution. Wrong! Evolution is a bush, not a ladder. When you unholster capitalization, exclamation marks, and italics, you really feel strongly. But of course, this is true only when you look at the branching realm of taxa, the products of evolution. If you look at the evolution of any single taxon or trait, you're dealing with linear lineages. Let's for the moment just forget that there's such thing as a horizontal gene transfer and hybridization. Those are complications we might discuss later. And he wasn't alone. The former keeper of entomology from the museum where I work, Quentin Wheeler, and his colleagues from the Spanish National Museum of Natural History in Madrid wrote an article for popular audiences in an online magazine, and they titled it Evolution Doesn't Proceed in a Straight Line. So why draw it that way? And there they have this much maligned iconography. But they didn't label these creatures. If these were a chimp and, well, the terminal tips of lineages, then yes, you cannot draw an evolutionary arrow between them. But if these are reconstructed fossils that you think were direct ancestors, or your best guesses of hypothetical ancestors in a single lineage, this is de facto the bare bones shape of evolution. It is just a lineage of transforming organisms tracking the arrow of time. But they were really, I guess, blind to the realm of lineages. They looked at this t-shirt from a high school brass marching band and they got very upset. They said, why less piety? It might be better for the public's knowledge of science if these t-shirts and bumper stickers ditch the step-by-step images and use branching diagrams to make a more nuanced and correct point about evolution. And these views, the views from Robert O'Hara and Stephen Jay Gould, have explicitly, I guess, fertilized views in the literature dedicated to science educators, like this paper in the Journal of Research in Science Teaching. They asked 50 sophomore students to look at 4 diagrams, these are 2 of these, of the evolution of horses and hominids, and say, can you describe what these depict? And a lot of students said, well, they used evolutionary language. For instance, if you look at the left diagram, they would say, oh, Homo habilis evolved into Homo erectus, evolved into Homo sapiens. And with the horse diagram, maybe Meryhippus evolved into Pleohippus. The trees they provided those students with have fossils in direct ancestral positions in the trees, because when those trees were drawn, the authors thought they may be the remains of real lineal ancestors. But they were so blinded by just looking at the branching aspect of nature that they said, well, more sophisticated responses by the students would involve the concept that one taxon shares a more recent common ancestor with another, rather than evolving from it. Well, you gave them diagrams that tricked them into giving what you think is the wrong interpretation, but in fact is the right. And they say, no, we go on. When we look at diagrams in textbooks and the popular press, we see evolutionary relationships suggesting the inappropriate anagenetic conception of evolutionary history. Anagenesis is one species evolving directly into another. So, okay, but isn't that what happens? Let's go to the presidential lecture that Stephen Jay Gould gave in 1988 when he became president of the Paleontological Association. He says, professionals, we know that evolution is bushy, like the tree here on the right. You look at horses and hominid trees, but still, if you look at any terminal tip, at the tip of the tree, we see the survivors as end products of a coherent anagenetic sequence within the bush. But how can it be otherwise? All evolution is anagenetic, i.e. happens in a lineage, until the lineage splits, and then you have two anagenetic lineages. But he missed this point. He said evolution rarely proceeds by the transformation of a single population from one stage to the next. This style called anagenesis would permit a ladder, a chain, a linear metaphor, to serve as a proper icon of change. But instead, evolution proceeds by an elaborate, complex series of branching events or episodes of speciation, technically called cladogenesis or branch making. He didn't seem to realize that if you have no anagenesis, then cladogenesis just creates a forest of identical twins. You cannot have the one without the other. You cannot oppose anagenesis and cladogenesis as contrasting, conflicting views of evolution. They are two distinct aspects of the same evolutionary coin. He never, in his voluminous writings, got this. And I don't have time in this talk to explain why. Maybe if there's time in the Q&A section, we can talk about it. But that misleading view has fertilized in a negative way the literature aimed at science educators. I have a paper recently submitted where I looked at the educational literature, and you can see here in the red box how Stephen Jay Gould's writings, especially, and those of Robert O'Hara, have tricked textbook authors and educators into thinking that the anagenetic origin of species is rejected. For instance, if you cite Catley et al. Again, change within a single species is well documented. One species changing into another is not. Well, that is a problem. Why? Anagenesis has nothing to do with species necessarily. The fundamental bedrock of evolution are evolving lineages. If you look at the tree on the right, you can trace a single lineage from the root at E through a segment D, C, B, all the way to A. How would you know whether the segment A of the lineage is a distinct species from segment B? You cannot, for instance, apply the biological species concept, which talks about about reproductive isolation. It is just a single unbranched lineage through the tree of life. And any changes along it are anagenetic changes. What Catley et al. And the other authors do, and that's showed in the right-hand column within the red box, they tie anagenesis specifically to the creation of species, of taxa, and that causes problems. They try to think about a lineage-level phenomenon with the inappropriate tools of the taxa, the products of evolution. Maybe B is a different species from A, but how would you know? Maybe you would use arbitrary differences in phenotype. The problem is that if you tie anagenesis to a taxic concept, namely the origin of species, you're missing the point. Anagenesis is simply evolution in continuous lineages extending through time. Now, if we go back to other concepts in the realm of lineages, for instance, missing links, if you read the literature, there is no concept as much hated and as much rejected in strong language than the concept of missing links. Take this article, for instance, in Smithsonian Magazine, written by Riley Black. She was the resident paleontologist for the blockbuster movie Jurassic World in 2015. Pretty cool movie. And she wrote this article and she said, the chain metaphor that missing link implies would have us looking for straight lines, when the reality of evolution is much more discursive. Not every fossil creature can be slotted in as a direct ancestor to something alive today. absolutely right. That's why paleontologists have come to abhor the term. It obscures the true pattern of evolutionary change. I find that puzzling. Henry G., trained as a paleontologist, wrote a book called The Accidental Species. And he said, I partly wrote this book because I wanted to explain why terms such as missing links encapsulate more than a century of error in thinking about evolution, particularly of humans. They reinforce a monstrous view of evolution whose function is to cement our own self-regard as the imagined pinnacle of creation. But aren't missing links real? Aren't they conceptually identical to direct lineal ancestors? Because evolution happens in continuous unbroken chains of descent, so they must be real. No, they aren't. And that is the irony. The rejection of the concept of missing links echoes specifically in the paleontological literature. Stephen Jay Gould, Donald Potter, Alan Gislick, who is a paleontologist working for the National Center of Science Education in the US. Potter and Gislick reject the concept of missing links with identical words. There simply is no such thing as a missing link. What Gould called missing link, the concept, a hoary and cliched concept, which is weird because in the very rare circumstances that we sometimes find fossils that to the best of our analyses could well be direct ancestors to taxa, they are true missing links. It is the realm that they study, the fossil record. For instance, a paper from a few years back by Parents Fukuchi et al., looking at hominin evolution and showing here with two photos that Australopithecus anamensis at the top is a direct ancestor, according to the best interpretation of the data they have, to Australopithecus afarensis. Awesome, great, because, it would be nice sometimes that the fossil record did spit out something that was truly a lineal ancestor of something else. And at the bottom, Homo antecessor, a direct ancestor to Homo heidelbergensis, which is a direct ancestor to both us and Homo neanderthalensis. So it is quite weird that especially paleontologists who should be totally enamored of the concept of missing links, it is especially they that reject it. And that brings us to a fourth story. They think there are ancestors in the fossil record, but they are different. Look, for instance, what Kevin Padian, a paleontologist, I think at the UC Berkeley, Donald Potter, Alan Gislick again, talk about bird evolution. And they look at Aotearoa, the famous fossil, that is not quite a modern bird if you do a phylogenetic analysis. It is perhaps, in this diagram, the sister group to a number of more modern birds. So it's not really an ancestor, right? It is a collateral relative. It is an evolutionary cousin. Not so, do Padian, Potter, and Gislick say. They said, we have different types of ancestors in the fossil record. We have lineal ones and collateral ones. Lineal ancestors are those that are directly ancestral to living organisms. So in the previous slide, for instance, these two hominid fossils. Collateral ancestors are organisms that share an ancestor with a living organism. But that means that they are collateral relatives, not ancestors. Relatives and ancestors are not the same thing. And indeed, Padian and Potter in their writings equate collateral ancestors with sister taxa, which are simply each other's closest relatives. That's not a relationship of an ancestor and a descendant. And it is important to not mix this up. A collateral ancestor is a concept in the realm of the branching relationships of taxa, of the products of evolution, not the linear realm of the relationship of true ancestors and their direct descendants. And then Alan Gislick, for instance, wrote this in a pamphlet for the debate against creationists. And creationists, they often say, oh no, a thing like Archaeopteryx is not really a direct ancestor of bird. And then they say, well, you may be right about that, but they are a collateral ancestor. That is confusing. Creationists know that relatives and ancestors are not the same thing. They will not mistake their uncle for their father. So for these scientists to get the two realms so wrong is actually quite shocking. And this is not a new mistake. In 1874, the founder of phylogenetics, Ernst Haeckel, already warned against it in his book Anthropogeny, a book specifically dedicated to explaining the lineage of evolution leading from the base of life to humans. He said you should never conflate their direct descendants with the sidelines, and also never extinct with living forms. This conflation happens very often, and our adversaries use the resulting mistaken views very often to combat the descent theory. 150 years today, Haeckel was already warning not to conflate these things, and yet some of our modern experts in the field certainly do. This is puzzling, and this is sad, which brings us to the fifth story, and in some ways, I guess, a culmination of the previous stories about what can go wrong. There's this curious situation that creationists and scientists, evolutionists, seem to agree on one thing. We did not evolve from monkeys and apes. Look, for instance, just before the pandemic, a science understanding test done by the BBC, test your knowledge of evolution. And they concluded scientific understanding of evolution is well accepted in the UK compared with other countries, but past surveys have suggested that at least 1 in 5 people are unsure about it. The classic one is people don't want to say, we're descended from apes, but actually we are not. We're descended from common ancestor, says Dr. Kay Fountain, a veterinary scientist. Oh, okay. And this seems to be consensus in the literature. If you look, for instance, at the website and magazine, Skeptic magazine from the Skeptics Society in America, top 10 myths about evolution. What's at number 1? Do we evolve? Did we evolve from apes and monkeys? And you can read it yourself here. It says, humans, apes, and monkeys are only distant evolutionary cousins. We come not from apes, but from a common ancestor. There was neither ape nor human. Okay, look at PBS, the Public Broadcasting Corporation in America. They have a resource online for teachers about evolution and for students. And what did they say? Did we come from monkeys? Humans didn't evolve from monkeys. Humans are more closely related to modern apes than to monkeys, but we didn't evolve from apes either. Okay, I was surprised when I read this, and it is a super widespread consensus. Here's Donald Prothero again with his book, and he wrote, thinking we come from monkeys is simply wrong. Believing it would be to live in a web of lies. But then you say, well, Don, I read your book. And then a couple of 100 pages earlier, you say, we still have the genes for the long tails of our monkey ancestors. What's going on, Don? Are you confused? Am I confused? What's going on? This is Eugenie Scott. She wrote an article about this specific question for the journal Evolution, Education and Outreach with a colleague from the National Center for Science Education. And what did they say? Ancient monkeys didn't evolve into apes. Many students are wrong about this linear sequence, monkeys, apes, humans. Sometimes scientists refer to the common ancestors of modern apes and humans as apes, though it would be clearer to students if we were more careful to distinguish such ancestors from living forms. So perhaps by consistently referring to them as fossil apes. Yes, that's correct. That's helpful. But it's not that humans descended from apes and that apes descended from monkeys. Rather, humans and apes share a common ancestor, and it is more recent than the common ancestor they both share with monkeys. This is confusing. So, yes, there was a fossil ape ancestor to humans, but then 1 page later, that is not really true anymore. What they do here, they ask a question from the realm of lineages. What did we humans evolve from? You need to answer this with the concepts of the realm of lineages. Instead, they stare blindly at the branching relationships of collateral relatives and rephrase the question in the language of taxa, groups of organisms sharing common ancestors. So they're rephrasing questions from one realm into the language of the other, and as a result, they get terribly confused. A final illustration from the Tree Thinking book by Bauman Smith from 2013. You probably all know, certainly the older audience members, there was a very famous TV presenter and interviewer in America called Larry King. And in 2005, he interviewed a philosopher who was very active in the fight against creationism, Barbara Forrest. He asked, if evolution is true, why are there still monkeys? For the record, Barbara changed the topic immediately and didn't really answer because perhaps she didn't know. But in the book, Bauman Smith writes, odd as this question may sound to an evolutionary biologist, Larry King could not be faulted for asking. If it if he has frequently heard biologists say humans evolved from apes, which evolved from monkeys. If instead human evolution were consistently described using more accurate language, my emphasis, hominids are a subgroup of apes. Apes are a subgroup of monkeys. Then Larry King and others like him might be less confused over the basic concepts of evolution. I read this and I'm very deeply confused because, yes, you can rephrase a question about the evolutionary descent of a taxon which can only be answered by looking at the realm of lineages and translate it into taxic language, groups within groups. But it is not more accurate or more confused or less confused. It is just a different way of looking at things and not a very good one. So let's try to analyze this in detail. Let's take as a framework a paper written again for an educational audience in Evolution, Education and Outreach by T. Ryan Gregory, an accomplished biologist. And he presented this tree, which is still the consensus of the relationships between monkeys, apes, and humans. And he said, humans are not descended from chimps. Correct, we are not. Or monkeys. Okay, and no sane biologist suggests otherwise. You start to feel maybe a bit stupid if you read this and you disagree. Monkeys are not ancestral to humans. The two lineages are related as distant cousins, not as grandparents and grandchildren. But Ryan, what do you mean two lineages? There's three. There's New World monkeys at the left-hand side, Old World monkeys, and humans. What are you talking about? If you draw the boxes around the groups of monkeys and apes, you get this. Monkeys here at the base and the apes slightly higher up. These are paraphyletic groups. These are groups that are defined by a common ancestor that includes some but not all its descendants. So if at the bottom of the tree at node Z, a hypothetical ancestor of all these primates, monkeys evolve and split in a monkeys from the New World and Old World monkeys, then they evolve, these monkeys, between nodes I and X into something else. They are called apes. And those apes evolve into something else at the top of the tree, into humans. But if these monkeys, these two lineages of monkeys are monkeys, then, between nodes Z and Y, well, those things, although we don't have fossils of those, must have been monkeys too. And if the branches of gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, and chimps are all apes, then the lineages in between them, X to W, W to V, V to U, well, those are apes as well. These are monkey ancestors and ape ancestors of us human beings. So yes, we did evolve from monkey ancestors and ape ancestors. But these authors denied. Funnily enough, if you look at the same books in which monkey ancestry of humans is denied, David Prothero, Eugene Scott, Donald Prothero, and also in Ryan Gregory's paper, they do accept that birds evolved from dinosaurs or are in fact dinosaurs. But the phylogenetic situation is the same. You can have a tree here where you have dinosaurs in a box, and then some dinosaurs, we no longer call those dinosaurs, we call those birds. And they have no problem inferring that. Why could they not make the same inference for primate evolution that they did for bird evolution? I can only speculate. I think it's perhaps they were so concerned with the past views about human evolution and teleological views that the human endpoint of evolution must have been foreordained, the anthropocentrism. They wanted, and that is of course all tied to this linear march of evolution, they wanted to deny that and focus extremely on the branching realm of evolution. And they overcompensated. And, I cannot explain it in any other way that the phylogenetic context of both human evolution and bird evolution is the same. And when they discuss them, they come to a different conclusion. And this is where it gets very interesting. And we go, towards the end of my talk. All informally recognized groups like dinosaurs, like apes, monkeys, reptiles, fishes, invertebrates, animals, some examples, are paraphyletic. These are groups of a common ancestor and some but not all of its descendants. For instance, monkeys are the monkeys but not apes. Reptiles are the reptiles, but not the ones, not mammals, not birds, even though they evolved from reptile ancestors. And the interesting thing is, if you use paraphyletic taxa, you can very easily talk about evolution because it creates this sort of exclusionary vocabulary that allows you to change identity as you go through a tree. Dinosaurs evolved, and then dinosaurs evolved into birds. Oh, one thing changes into another. This is the intuitive understanding of non-experts of what evolution is all about. It is the change of a thing into another thing, the transformation of a thing into another thing. But of course, the problem is systematists don't like paraphyletic groups, and for good reason. They are artificial. They are not real units. What systematists want is monophyletic groups. That is a common ancestor and all the descendant taxa, like mammals. The mammal ancestor plus everything that evolved after it, well, they're all mammals. Because monophyletic groups, also known as clades, have a real evolutionary individuality. So we should not recognize formally such paraphyletic groups. But as I said, the literature, especially in the pre-cladistic literature, cladistics started to infiltrate systematic biology from the 1950s onwards. In the English language literature, only in the mid-1960s and onwards. So if you look at Julian Hoxie's diagram on the left, you can see a phylogeny of some vertebrates, and it has all these paraphyletic groups. Achnatons evolving into placoderms, and some of the placoderms evolving into bony fish, and some of the bony fish evolving into reptiles, etc. And the tree next to it, paraphyletic taxa of nemergent ribbonworms. Why? Well, that's because taxa are the only named entities that biologists have. We don't give lineages names. So if you want to talk about lineage evolution with the vocabulary of systematics, using these paraphyletic names are very useful to talk about evolution. So, but that's a problem. Modern biologists don't like it. So for instance, with respect to this nemergent tree, Micah Helen said, recognizing them, paraphyletic taxa, and using them as stages in evolutionary sequences, we used to call these things grades, is a common narrative device, a way of telling stories in natural history, but it gives a false, distorted view of the evolutionary chronicle. I beg to differ. These biologists just try to talk about evolution with the only vocabulary they had available. And of course, we understand this because we are well aware of changing identities along a continuous flow of change in another realm, our own lives. We've all been an embryo and then became a fetus, and then we became a newborn, a toddler, an adolescent, etc. This is a similar use of a type of exclusionary language to show that along one continuous flow of change in the life of an individual, you go through non-overlapping stages. An embryo becomes a fetus, is no longer an embryo. When the fetus turns into a newborn, it's no longer a fetus. It is the same logic that we use to describe changing transformations in a continuous flow of life that the biologists use when they use these paraphyletic names. But as I said with the previous slide, we don't recognize paraphyletic taxa as valid groups. Now let's try to talk about evolutionary descent using the language of monophyletic groups, of real clades, boxes within boxes. That becomes quite weird. So if you then look at humans, can we say, did we evolve from apes? Note X, hominoidea. Well, no, we are apes. It's like asking, did beetles evolve from insects? No, they are insects. Okay, well, did we evolve then at least from old world primates? No, we are old world primates. If you try to ask questions about evolutionary descent, about lineages evolving, but you only use the language of monophyletic taxa, it seems that the answer dissolves in a sort of preformationist paradox. Nothing evolves into anything. Everything is already there. And that's why I printed it out like this, spell it out. The language of monophyletic taxa, which is the only formally condoned language we have for real groups, is fundamentally unsuited to talking about lineage evolution, because ancestor-descendant relationships, which is the relationships that tie together lineages do not exist between monophyletic taxa. So we scuppered. How do you talk about evolution then? Can you talk about evolution if you're not allowed to use the nicely exclusionary paraphyletic taxa names? Well, yes, we can. Peter X, a German zoologist whose 97th birthday would have been next week, came up in the mid-80s, 1985, this paper was published, with the stem lineage concept. He understood there were two kinds of things in the world, taxa and lineages, and they occupy different roles. They have a different ontology, and they have different epistemic value. So if you want to understand the evolution of placental mammals, you need to look at the stem lineage of therians. And so he formalized it, that stem lineages are these direct ancestor-descendant lineages that connect recognized and named monophyletic taxa. And if we use that approach, you can talk about lineage evolution as a flow of constantly changing identities. For instance, if you go to the base of the human lineage industry, to number 1, some of our ancestors were semi-eformers, which is all the creatures from the node Z up. But between node and Z, those specific semi-eformers are stem catarrhines. And a little higher up in our ancestral lineage, between nodes Y and X, you have stem hominoids. And a little higher still, stem hominids, etc. So if you use the language of stem lineages, which specifically refers to bits of lineages, you can talk about lineage evolution in a proper way. Using the names of monophyletic taxa makes things very, very difficult. And a lot of people get that wrong. It would be cool, I mean, I don't know if you teach evolution, try it out. I haven't done it myself yet, but ask the students, did we evolve from monkeys or apes, or are we monkeys and apes? And see if they understand the concepts properly. Last few slides. If you are a biologist, no matter whether you work on genomics, so I lied, I say it twice, or on fossils or on living creatures, this is what evolution looks like. You got a bunch of specimens, and descent of evolutionary descent is hidden away in the depths of time. It's part of this epistemic hinterland that is invisible. The only way to get access to evolving lineages, again, unless you work on laboratory strains of, say, bacteria, is to infer based on observations in the products of evolution. To make this realm visible, you need to triangulate your observations from the taxa, the name taxa, which is the only evidence we have of evolution. Now, if you give a task to students, they don't understand this. If you show this, these images to students and you say, can you put them in a phylogeny? Very often they just draw arrows between them. Now, we know as experts that is wrong because these are cousins, not ancestors and descendants. But the intuitive understanding of the non-expert is that evolution is a flow of things, one thing changing into another thing. So you can give them fantasy animals and they do the same thing. This is a student, Melanie, a sophomore student. She was given these imaginary creatures and then tasked with building a phylogenetic tree. And she puts them, almost all of them, into a linear sequence. One evolves into another, adds a little bitty there, and then the next step adds a little bitty there. But then the teacher says this, he constructed a flowchart, flowchart image tree depicting a linear progression of relatedness from primitive to advanced. It directly connected species rather than generating a scientifically acceptable branching tree. I'm not surprised. Understanding the relationship, as I've shown in this talk, between the linear and branching aspects of evolution is very challenging. You can see it play out in the history of evolutionary biology. And many of the chapters in my book are exactly about this. And you can see it in the intellectual development of individual students in your classes. What is the solution? Teach lineage thinking and tree thinking together. Don't just give them some specimens and then ask them to draw a tree and then say, look, you got it wrong. Start by saying that evolution is a process. In the left-hand diagram, for instance, and this comes from David Baum, you have sexual reproduction between organisms. And if you then zoom out, you can see a lineage emerge. And then you go to the picture in the middle, And that lineage of a local population is a specific smaller lineage of a larger bundle of lineages of the entire species. And if you zoom out even further, you can see that over time, such lineages split into different lineages. And some of these are taxa, they are real named organisms, and you have an evolutionary tree. Or if you want to do it with imaginary creatures like the tree on the right, make sure to explain that these intermediate ancestral organisms were real too. It is just the absence of evidence that we have that makes this realm so hypothetical. So with that, I want to close. Teach students that there is different realms of evolution that require different concepts, different ways of thinking. The focus on the cladistic relationships between organisms should not be a blindfold that blinds you from lineage evolution. It should be a conduit, an index rather, of empirically available evidence with which you can infer what may have happened along evolving lineages. And with that, much to your relief, I bet, I'm done at 48 minutes and 50 seconds.